As we begin, we're going to start today with a prayer of St. Thomas Aquinas before study. So it looks like I've got everybody muted here. I'm going to share my screen. Everybody see my screen? All right, if you just want to pray along with me here. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, lofty origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your brilliance penetrate into the darkness of my understanding, and take from me the double darkness in which I have been born, an obscurity of both sin and ignorance. Give me a sharp sense of understanding, a retentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. Grant me the talent of being exact in my explanations, and the ability to express myself with thoroughness and charm. Point out the beginning, direct the progress, and help in completion, through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So this is the St. Thomas Aquinas prayer before study. If you just Google it, you'll find several different versions of it, or several different translations, I guess. It's a great prayer. And I like to often use it before study. So here's where we are, session 5, medieval philosophy and St. Thomas Aquinas. So if you have questions during the session, if you don't necessarily want to interrupt right away, but you want to ask your question, then you can also just type it into the chat box, and it will go to Sarah. Do you get the messages in the chat box?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I just kind of keep it while you're lecturing. I just kind of pop in on it every once in a while to make sure I'm not missing anything. But it usually pops up.
Do you see a message in your chat box right now from Catherine? It should have gone to you and to me, I think.
No, because I may not have been in the meeting when she typed it, unless she just typed it. Yep. I got one from somebody, though.
Okay. All right. Well, one way or another, I will keep my...
I just got a chat from Jason, so it's working.
Okay.
But,
all right. So you can send your chat to Sarah, or you can interrupt and blurt it out. Either way is fine, but just depending on your preference. So feel free to send Sarah your question. Yes.
So I'm seeing Gina's chat on your screen. I'm sorry, Catherine's chat. Catherine, make sure that you're messaging.
Yeah, I see it too.
Make sure you're messaging me and not John if you have that option.
All right.
You're right. I just clicked on it. Thank you. I saw Sarah after clicking on the down button on John's name. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, great. Okay, so we're going to jump now into medieval philosophy and St. Thomas Aquinas. Here's a little overview. First, in two parts, in the first part being history of medieval philosophy, 4 main points we're going to cover: the transition from antiquity into the medieval period, and then just a little bit about Muslim and Jewish philosophy. We're just going to do a very brief introduction to 3 philosophers there. We're going to talk about the recovery of Aristotle's texts, or the discovery of them in a way, in the West, and then scholastic philosophy. Then in the second part for St. Thomas Aquinas, we're going to look a bit about with his life and context. We're going to discuss what it is, his significance as a philosopher, since we tend to think of him as a theologian. And then we're going to go into details about reading Aquinas and how to dig into his texts. The image you see over on the right, this is St. Thomas in the middle, of course, and he is flanked by Aristotle and Plato. And he is shown, I'm not sure if this is Averroes or Avicenna, but it's one of the two main Muslim philosophers that St. Thomas both drew on and also refuted in many ways, who were also expounders of Aristotle. So that's just a little bit of an explanation of that image here. Okay, let's take a look now. Medieval philosophy. We're talking about a period from the death of Boethius, whose text we're going to look at shortly, until the Renaissance, approximately. We're not going to cover a whole lot of philosophers from that period, but that's generally the period we're talking about when we look at medieval philosophy. Some of the themes here, we're going to look at the fact that there was a bit of tension, competition, cooperation as well between religion and philosophy. And some themes here also are God, the divine mind and what constitutes that, the problem of universals, which we've introduced a little bit in previous sessions, on the cosmos and nature and the soul. We're not going to dig into all of these topics, but those are a lot of the main themes that were the subject of discussions in medieval philosophy. And I have on the bottom this famous quote from Tertullian, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Of course, this is an anti-philosophical reference here. Athens representing philosophy and Jerusalem representing religion. Let's go into a bit about the transition from the ancient period into the medieval period. We're going to look at two philosophers here. Of course, St. Augustine, first of all. St. Augustine of Hippo was trained, and Hippo is in northern Africa. He was trained as a rhetorician, and he came across what he calls in the Confessions, the books of the Neoplatonists, by way of another philosopher, Marius Victorinus. Now, Marius Victorinus was a well-known, also a rhetorician, and a Platonist, a well-known Platonist, very famous. And then he, by reading the Gospels, by reading the Scriptures, he was converted to Christianity, but he was afraid because of what it would do to his reputation to convert. And St. Augustine tells this story in the Confessions where Victorinus would have these discussions with another intellectual who had become Christian, Simplicianus. And Simplicianus would hear Victorinus say to him, "Know that I'm a Christian," but Victorinus wouldn't actually go and be baptized. And Simplicianus said, "I will not rank you among the Christians until I see you in the Church of Christ." And then when Victorinus eventually did agree to do that, the clergy offered for that to be private, but he wanted to make it very decisive. So he had a very public baptism, and he was acclaimed in that regard by the other Christians in Milan. So St. Augustine, some of the main themes of him from a philosophical perspective: epistemology. We've talked before about the theory of divine illumination, which is St. Augustine's way of bringing the Platonic doctrine of the forms, as far as they are a principle of knowledge, in line with the Catholic faith. And he talked about faith and reason, intersubjective knowledge, free will. These were big themes for St. Augustine. His works, the main works that, of course, he wrote quite a few. He was extremely prolific, but we know of his Confessions, of course. There are certainly philosophical parts of that, especially his reflection on time. The City of God, which is a massive work that he wrote over a period of about a decade. And it's very wide-ranging, and it really shows off all of his skills in different styles of rhetoric at the time. On the Trinity, his work on the Trinity is a way of trying to discuss the Trinity and relating it to the human person as well, going from the idea that the human person is made in the image of God, image and likeness of God. Well, what can we perhaps discover about the Trinity by looking at the human person? And he explores different ways to do that. Then he has several different dialogues, and they serve as an example both of a dialectical and an interactive teaching method, which was adapted to the particular training of the student. So this was based on his theory of how to learn. It was adapting to the student. I have a little bit here of a selection from one of his soliloquies. And this is a famous passage, and there's a lot about this that represents how St. Augustine conceives of philosophy. So I'm just going to give you a minute to read through this. This is a dialogue between two. You could imagine the normal text, not the italicized text, the normal text being Augustine himself. So two things I want to point out here. My light goes out again. Okay, here we go. Two things I want to point out. One, what does he want to know? God and the soul. God and the soul. And this is the theme of his philosophy. It is faith seeking understanding. It's primarily faith going deeper with understanding. And then there's a dilemma here. First, explain how, if God should be set forth to you, you would be able to say, it is enough. How do you know when you've learned enough to know God? How do you know? And he says, I don't know. I don't know how I could say it is enough. For I believe not that I know anything in such wise as I desire to know God. So he recognizes that that infinite desire for God. Okay, Boethius, he was a Roman statesman in Ostrogothic Italy, and he had quite a few works on mathematics, music. I first came across his name in my music studies, learning music history, and philosophy as well. So he has philosophical translations and commentaries on previous philosophers, including Aristotle. We'll see some of those come up later. He was imprisoned and executed for a conspiracy to overthrow Theodoric the Great, who was the emperor at the time. So we're going to take a look at an excerpt from his Consolation of Philosophy. The form of that is a prosometrum, which means that it's prose with verse interludes. And actually, relatively recently, a few years ago, there were some manuscripts discovered from the Middle Ages that had the verse parts with music notation. So these scratches right here are actually music notation, and this is over the text right here, which is one of the verses from one of the hymns in it. And then these were actually set to music. There was an attempt at reconstructing these, and and they made recordings of these. So if you look up, if you search Google for Boethius Constellation of Philosophy music, then you'll be able to find that. So he wrote this while he was in prison, and some of the themes in this were the accord between free will and divine foreknowledge. And he also offers a non-theological theodicy. And what's a theodicy? A theodicy is an explanation for how there can be evil in the world, even though there's a good God. It's similar to the problem of evil, but it's a little bit different because it already assumes that God exists. So when I mean non-theological, he doesn't draw on scripture for it. He approaches it purely from a philosophical point of view. So now let's take a look at this excerpt of Boethius from the Constellation. Anybody want to tackle any of these questions here about the relationship between will and power? Or whether the good and the wicked seek the same thing? And his walking analogy.
Number 2, the good and the wicked, yes, they do seek the same thing. It's just that the wicked is not exercising his natural abilities.
Exactly. Yeah. How could we work how does the walking analogy fit in to that?
Because the wicked person would be like the human who's walking on his hands.
That's right. So they're trying to get to the same thing, the same ultimate thing. And we'll see this next week when we're looking at ethics with Aristotle and Aquinas, that there's an ultimate good, and all of us, no matter what, we're doing it under the aspect of this ultimate good. It's the particular things where we can get mixed up. And so Boethius has this idea of using, or Lady Philosophy uses this example of comparing this to somebody who's trying to walk, but using their hands instead of their feet. How about anybody on the relationship between will and power?
Well, isn't that basically just what you want and versus your ability to get it? What you desire versus your capacity to actually get what you desire.
That's right. So we have to have these match up, right? Our will to do something and the power to do it. If we have the power and we don't have the will, well, we're not going to do it. But likewise, if we have the will and we don't have the power to do it, we also don't. And here we can look at the word virtue. Comes from a word that means strength, virtus. So you can think of that virtue as a power, as an ability to do something in this passage from Boethius. Any questions on this?
Oh, I had a quick question. Sorry, someone else want to ask?
No, go ahead, Gina, because it's probably the same one I have.
I've just noticed the happiness section.
Mm-hmm.
They all kind of agreed that it was a given that happiness is the absolute good. Did I miss that somewhere? Have we not covered it, or?
So we looked
Briefly, we covered it
weeks ago. Yeah, when we looked at a passage from Aristotle's Ethics where he says that happiness is the ultimate good, and basically a very short summary of that argument, which we'll recapitulate next week, is the highest good is going to be well, you know what? I'm not going to try to recap that whole argument from memory, but maybe that'll just be the advertisement to come back next week. Or
Yeah.
revisit that little passage from Aristotle, which we may just look at again.
Okay. But it's something that they all obviously agree on at this point.
That's right. So this is something that he gets from that he receives from Aristotle. And if we remember from a couple weeks ago, looking at the Neoplatonists thought that they could reconcile both Aristotle and Plato. They saw them as part of the same thing. So Boethius falls in this Neoplatonist stream. So he draws both on Aristotle and on Plato. And this is something which is right from Aristotle, that that the highest good is happiness. And it's related to the idea that happiness is what all men seek.
Okay, thanks.
Catherine, did you
Yeah,
have a question?
so John, dovetailing on what Gina said, in reading this and rereading it, my confusion with Lady Philosophy is that how can a righteous man exercise the natural virtues and attain the highest good, but how can Boethius say that wicked men attain the highest good when what I'm thinking of are the nefarious creatures, say, in politics or even in the church, whose highest good is to have us, gone, is to have us die. Can a wicked person see the highest good as killing other people who don't subscribe to their alternate sensibilities of what is good?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And we'll, again, next week when we're looking at ethics, that will be a lot clearer. But the short answer of it is that that all of us have a general desire toward the good in a very general way, in kind of think of it in a sort of unclear, nebulous way, towards the good. And the particular things that we choose along the way are done under the aspect of getting us to the ultimate good, to the ultimate happiness. So the idea that getting rid of my political enemies or my theological enemies is a good, somebody might say that's the highest good, but it's not. It's a particular good. That's
I
a
see.
particular
Gotcha.
good. It's not the case that ultimate perfect happiness is going to be attained when they get to that. So we have a general will towards the good that everybody shares, and but then according to reason and nature and our habits, we're disposed towards intermediate goods along the way.
That's perfect. Thank you. Okay.
All right.
So Aristotle actually was saying that men don't ostensibly try to be bad. It's just that they don't know any better. They're going for what they perceive to be what's good.
In a way, yes, and in a way, no. So if we go back before Aristotle to Plato, Plato will equate virtue with knowledge and vice with ignorance. So Plato will say that if anybody does evil, it's purely because they don't know, that if they knew, they would choose rightly. Aristotle has a bit more nuance than that. So what we'll see with Aquinas and Aristotle is an idea that all of us do have a will towards ultimate good. Nobody has an inclination towards ultimate evil. It's impossible. And that the particular things that we choose along the way, to some extent, is it ignorance? Yeah. To some extent it is. And so next week we'll look at a lot more in depth about how does our intellect and our will relate when it comes to ethical choices. But I don't think that that either Aquinas or Aristotle would say that anybody willingly chooses wickedness as wickedness. They choose wickedness under the aspect of the good. Even saying that, I know that according to this set of principles, this is evil, but it's good for me right now. So it's a little bit more nuanced.
Okay, thanks. I thought I saw something like that too in the Marcus Aurelius passage, where that seemed to be an assumption that
Right.
Marcus Aurelius is making.
Okay, let's go back to our presentation now. And if I could go ahead and have everybody mute yourselves. Hey, we're going to look at briefly at two Muslim and one Jewish philosopher from the Middle Ages. So these three philosophers were also Neoplatonic in this synthesizing Aristotle's prime mover, who is the principle of all being, and Plato's form of the good, which we saw when we read the allegory of the cave, the form of the good, which is really the source of everything. And then the Neoplatonist Plotinus, he has the one as the ultimate principle for everything. So there were translations into Arabic of Aristotle's works and some of Plato. Then there were also two Neoplatonic works called the Theology of Aristotle and the Book of Causes. And the interesting thing about these is that they were thought to be written by Aristotle, I think even up through the Scholastic period with St. Thomas. And then it was only later that they were discovered that it was discovered that they weren't written by Aristotle. So these three philosophers, one is Avicenna, and going on that theme of medieval philosophy of trying to reconcile religion and philosophy, he did that with Islam. He was, both him and Averroes, the next one, were extremely prolific. Avicenna has over 100 surviving works and very wide-ranging in subject matter, everything from physical science and medicine to mystical theology and physical or philosophical treatises, some of them very short and some of them encyclopedic. A major theme for him was the distinction between essence and existence. So we can think about a thing without that thing existing, right? A classic example is a unicorn. When I say unicorn, you think of a unicorn, but there's not an actual existing unicorn. And this comes into play with Aquinas as well, when he's talking about that God's existence is different than ours. We can have, for contingent things, for created things, there's a distinction between the essence and the existence, a distinction between what we are and that we are. But for God, as the necessary existence, his existence is his essence. There can't be a separation of that. Another thing that Avicenna discussed, which Aquinas refuted several times, is the idea of a universal active intellect. If we remember the active intellect, that was in a way Aquinas's way of reconciling Plato, Augustine, and Aristotle, where the active intellect is the light of reason placed in us by God, which allows us to reason. Now, for Aquinas, this is individual for each person. It's created for each person. For Avicenna, there was one universal active or agent intellect. Okay, Averroes, who is referred to simply as the commentator in Aquinas's works, just as Aquinas refers to Aristotle as the philosopher. He was especially famous for his commentaries on Aristotle, of course. And he had 2 to 3 per work, some short, some medium, and some long. And his distinction, he had major intellectual differences between Muslim theologians and Avicennan doctrines as well. Both of these philosophers got in trouble politically at various times. Okay, then probably the most famous Jewish philosopher, Moses Maimonides, known more familiarly by Jews as Rambam. He is especially famous for, in the Jewish tradition, for his commentary on the Mishnah, which is a collection of rabbinic oral traditions, and also for compiling and writing the Mishnah Torah, which is a code of Jewish religious law. So he was, besides being a philosopher, also an astronomer and physician. And he was born in Spain, but then eventually became the head of a Jewish community in Egypt, where he worked as a rabbi and philosopher, and that was where he died. Philosophically, he's most famous for his Guide to the Perplexed, which is designed to bring a perplexed reader of scripture trying to come to terms with all of the Jewish legal requirements to a point of understanding and practicing them. And this is a picture of an artist's representation of Moses Maimonides over on the right. Okay, so let's go on to our next theme, which is looking at the recovery of Aristotle. I think really recovery should be in quotes because it was never quite lost. It was just sort of stored away somewhere and not translated into Latin. I like the phrasing in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy in the article on medieval philosophy, where it says, why didn't we have them? We didn't have them because they were written in the wrong language. And by this point, nobody was reading Greek. So that was a problem. But there was also there was sort of a lack of interest. And a couple other quotes here, which I think are great, from St. Jerome. How many people know Plato's books or his name? Idle old men on the corners hardly recall him. And then the contemporary philosopher Etienne Gilson says, Plato himself does not appear at all, but Platonism is everywhere, talking about the Middle Ages. So there was a lot of Platonism by means of Neoplatonism that was transmitted directly, but Plato's actual works in the West were not studied except for one. So in Latin, before Aristotle's works were translated, there was just a translation and commentary of Plato's Timaeus, which is really not a representative dialogue of very much of his doctrine other than his cosmology. Then there were translations of Aristotle's logical works. And this is interesting because some of his greatest works in physics and metaphysics and ethics, those were not translated. But his logical works were. And so he was primarily thought of in that respect as a logician. And we just learned a little bit about Boethius. Well, he's the one who's responsible for translating Aristotle's logical works first in the form that the medievals received him. We did not have almost all of Plato, any of Plotinus, and most of Aristotle. Then just in the middle of the 1100s, these began to be translated. And they were gradually translated over the next 150 years or so. Okay, before I go on to scholasticism, any questions here on these three topics we've looked at?
Do you know offhand what some of the titles were, the logical works of Aristotle were available?
Yes, I can pull those up actually. Let's see if I can get a list of. Okay, so Aristotle's logical works, On Interpretation is one. Prior and Posterior Analytics, the Topics, and then I missed one at the top, the Categories. So those are his logical works, and so they discuss there. It's really the first. You can't really say Aristotle invented logic because logic is part of our human reason. But Aristotle really was the first one ever to expound logic and to bring those principles to light. So those are his logical works. Some of the shorter ones, On Interpretation, I think is probably is pretty accessible. That may even be the first one in the series. St. Thomas has commentaries on those as we'll look at in a bit. Any other questions?
John, who translated them, and how did they select which ones to translate?
You mean in the period starting the 1100s?
Right.
That's a good question. I don't know offhand.
Or is it that that's what they had available at the time, and the other documents came through at a later time?
So the ones that they had, they received from
The Muslims.
Boethius.
Boethius.
So,
Okay.
So Aristotle's logical works they had from Boethius. The rest were basically, my understanding is, they were sitting in a library, untranslated, and I couldn't tell you offhand exactly what prompted that, but it may have been related to the fact that at this time there were translations of the Muslim philosophers into Latin from Arabic, possibly by way of a couple other languages.
Yeah, this is a period of time the Muslims were running all over the area.
Yes.
So the Muslims probably had them?
There were some, but I think primarily they had been. I don't know that they had them still in Greek. I'll have to look at that and get back to you. But you could also look, if you look on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy in the medieval philosophy, that may.
I'll take a look at it.
Yeah.
I was reading about it in another book, more of a history of just a superficial thing, and yeah, they, who decided what to translate and how did they, and I just figured, well, they found it and they translated it and the rest were hidden, and that's rather than some guy going through, or Boethius going through and saying, okay, I'm going to do this one and this one, but not these.
Yeah. I'll take a look and send you something.
Okay. Hey, thanks.
So looking at the next period of philosophy, scholastic philosophy, up to this point, the medieval philosophy in the West continued in the spirit of St. Augustine. So that what we said about faith-seeking understanding, right? There was a continuous tradition of monastic schools, but some of the developments in this period were the rise of universities with theology and philosophy curricula. And then in particular that we're going to be interested in is the dialectical method of pursuing these subjects, which was analytical, drawing very fine distinctions between things, and a method called disputation, which involved asking questions, posing objections, and then a reply to those objections and refuting them. So we'll look at how that plays out in the Summa. And right along with the rediscovery of Aristotle, then this was aimed at, or in some cases we'll see, opposed to a reconciliation of ancient Greek philosophy with Catholic dogma, with Plato, with Aristotle. So St. Anselm of Canterbury is considered the father of scholasticism. He was the abbot at Bec in Normandy first, and then he was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury against his will. This picture over here on the right is a depiction of him supposedly being forced by the bishops in England to get out of his bed and go and take up the Archbishopric of Canterbury. He is especially famous for his proofs of God's existence from reason alone. But still in the Augustinian tradition of faith-seeking understanding, we're going to look at one of these arguments called the ontological argument in a minute. Then one final thing about scholasticism is when we get into modern and contemporary philosophy, constantly philosophers are railing against scholasticism and the schoolmen, as they call them. So it really becomes a target for modern philosophy, but they unfortunately often oversimplify or don't really engage the arguments of the scholastics. So we'll see how that comes out when we get to modern and contemporary philosophy in session 8. So let's take a look at this excerpt from St. Anselm from his Proslogion. This is the second of two of his major works. The other is the Monologion. So when we're looking at that, comparing the first paragraph of this to Marcus Aurelius, from that meditation of Marcus Aurelius that we looked at before, how is this similar to or different than that?
They both talk about shutting yourself out from the world and meditating and reflecting.
Right. So we have that kind of seclusion within. But what makes this different?
Doesn't he include that you're meditating on God?
Exactly. So enter the inner chamber of your mind. Shut out all thoughts save that of God. So this is but I think that it's striking the resemblance between the two of that interior movement. And that we can perhaps look at some of that Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius and some of his fellow Roman Stoics coming into the practice of the church in that idea of meditating and withdrawing from the world. But we have this key difference of we have God invited in. So in looking at the second paragraph, what's the significance of the phrase, I do not know your form?
Well, doesn't he just mean I can't see you, I can't perceive you with my senses?
That's right. Yeah. So the senses are important here. So what's the significance of using the word form?
So back with the idea of form being like the absolute or most perfect version of something, right? When we're talking about like the form of man, he's saying he can't identify the form of God, right? Because I'm guessing it's just because like what you were saying of, right, the essence of God is the form of God.
Right. So how do we come to know the forms of things?
Through observation, typically. And so
Yeah,
right,
through sense perception, right? So, but we can't have that of God. So this is I just point this out to say that this is where we have an intersection of a philosophical concept with his meditation, that he relates it to this this lament for trying to seek God. And then in the next paragraph, what does Anselm consider more important, believing or understanding?
Believing? No?
I'm saying understanding.
No, definitely believing. What he's trying to say here is that God is a supreme being. And like you were saying, John, he's entering now, he's leaving philosophy and entering theology. He's saying there is a supreme being and there's no way I'll ever understand it. But he says in order to get there, he has to first believe. It reminded me of what one of the Gospels, Lord, teach me, give me faith so I can believe, or whatever. But what I thought about it was, is it baptism? I know they're not mentioning it, but it seems like there's a huge leap forward by grace, perhaps, to understand that there's something called God's providential will, and that because we have grace, we can see we're made in God's image and likeness, and therefore we can believe in faith, but we won't understand until the end. But he says here, Anselm says in quotes, "My heart believes and loves this invisible God," and he consoles himself. Yeah.
So Jerry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say he treats believing as a road or a method to understanding. The understanding is the goal, is more important than the believing, or to use the phrase he's been saying, it's faith seeking understanding.
Yeah, so he says at the end, towards the end of 1.8, "For I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand." So this goes back to what we were just talking about the form. So if we think about understanding as knowing the form of something, the form being one of the causes, right? The formal cause. Of course, God has no causes, so form is not a cause for God, it's just his essence. And that's what we seek. Anselm is lamenting first, "I do not know your form." And then he says, he's using, so I believe in order to understand. So belief is on the way to understanding. Catherine, you're right. We don't know God until the end. We don't understand God. We don't grasp God's essence until we see him face to face. But we continue to seek and to understand.
In a more colloquial expression, it's, at the end, faith, hope, and charity, only charity exists. Faith no longer exists because now you know.
That's right. That's right. So at the end, there's no more need for either faith or hope.
I'd run across this statement of Anselm's before, and it really kind of struck me as being, I guess maybe backwards from the way most people, or the way modern people tend to look at things, is probably even then. I mean, can you actually believe in something that you don't first understand? Don't you have to go through kind of a process of understanding and say, okay, so there's some assent there, but he's flipped it, and I guess it seems to have flipped it. That's still a little, I don't know, counterintuitive.
And what really confused me was the very last line, that unless I believed, I should not understand. So why is believing not the most important thing? Because without it, you can't understand.
Because it's not the most important thing, because it's a means. It's not the end. So believing is not the end. Understanding ultimately is the end. And to get to Kirk's question, can you remind me of it again? I just lost it.
Okay, this is it. When he says, "Okay, I do not seek to understand that I may believe. That seems to be kind of the typical way people's.
Oh, okay. So you're talking about, yes. All right. Now I remember what I was going to say. So,
Why should I believe in something that I don't understand?
right.
He's reversed it, and I guess I'm still kind of trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I think a great, when we get into modern philosophy, some modern Christian existentialists will, I think, do a great job of kind of showing the difference that when we embrace something in faith, it's not looking at it as an object of knowledge right here in front of me to study, but it's a way of life. It becomes a part of our life. Kierkegaard, his way of doing this, the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, will talk about truth as subjectivity. And he doesn't mean truth is subjective, but real truth of the truths of faith are something that become our way of life. And so with the things of faith, the doctrines of faith, the truths of faith, we don't have the ability to grasp them in the way we can natural things. We can't grasp their form, but we can grasp some of them in an indirect way as causes. So we can come to know naturally that there is an ultimate cause that we call God, but we can't come to know God's essence that way. That requires something else, something that we don't have the capability to do. And to get beyond those basic things, we need the grace of faith. The grace of faith gives us knowledge, gives us the same kind of certainty, even a greater degree of certainty in things that are not seen, as we talked about in the very first session, than the things that are seen. So we still have knowledge and certainty, but it's not of the same kind. So there's a certain indirect way that we do know the things that we believe in, but there's a certain way we can't know them according to the natural way that we can with faith. That requires a strengthening of that natural light of reason, which is by the grace of faith. Okay, great questions. We're gonna have to go on here to St. Thomas. Okay, so St. Thomas Aquinas, a little bit about his life and context here. So his childhood studies were at the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino, and then his liberal arts education in Naples. Then he entered the Dominicans against the will of his family. In fact, there's a famous story about the fact that his brothers sent a prostitute to him. They locked him up and sent a prostitute to try to lure him into sin and keep him from entering the Dominicans. And he drove her away, and then he was visited by angels and given a white cord, which was a representation of his chastity. So for that reason, he's a patron saint of chastity. We see this image over on the right, that depiction of St. Thomas being visited by the angels after that. Then he studied with Albert the Great at Cologne. So this is significant because this is right in the period that Aristotle's works were being more widely known in the West, and Albert was the first one to really use them, to teach them. And St. Thomas certainly became his greatest student of those works. And he taught at various places. He taught at Paris, in the university there. He taught at papal courts and at some Dominican houses of study. A few things I want to mention: the Paris condemnations. If you ever see this come up in discussions of St. Thomas Aquinas, there's a series of condemnations directed towards what were considered heretical beliefs at the University of Paris. And this was by the bishop at the time, Bishop Tampier, and they were mainly directed towards philosophers who were using arguments from Aristotle and Averroes that came to conclusions that were contrary to the faith. So, for instance, regarding the eternity of the world, so Aristotle argues for the eternity of the world. Averroes does as well. Well, there were Latin Averroists, these Christian philosophers who took that and basically sort of had this bifurcation between theology and philosophy, where philosophy would prove one thing that could be contrary to the faith, and or other things were concerned the nature of God's knowledge, or whether there was a first man and a first woman. So if you think of the universe and the world being eternal, then they thought there was no beginning to humanity, that it always was. So in 1277, that series of condemnations condemned several propositions that seemed to have been drawn from St. Thomas's writings, but not mentioning anybody by name. It seems that the main target of those were two other philosophers. St. Thomas was not a Latin Averroist. He did not subscribe to beliefs like the one I just mentioned, but the ambiguity of that and his association with it did hurt his reputation for a while. However, he was, those condemnations were lifted later. And another investigation by Bishop Tampier was abandoned at the order of the Roman Curia. So there's a famous story again about St. Thomas towards the end of his life, where he has an ecstasy, and after that vision, he says to another philosopher who's trying to get him to continue writing, "All that I have written seems like straw to me." And for that reason, actually, the Summa Theologiae is not completed. So a little bit about his works. He has three main types. He has treatises. We're going to look at a passage from the Summa Contra Gentiles. So a treatise just being a straightforward laying out of arguments. Disputations like the Summa Theologiae, and we're going to look at that. And then he has commentaries. His commentaries are extremely helpful in understanding the structure, as we'll see in a little bit. Okay, so let's take a look at this passage from Summa Contra Gentiles. This is our third reading. So where do forms in actual existing material things have to come from?
The agent intellect, or the intellectual agent?
Okay, it comes from an intellect, but if we think about the ultimate source of the forms in material things, what does St. Thomas say about that, and how it relates or doesn't relate to Plato?
Plato thought that they were inherent in the matter itself, and it's not spelled out exactly, but I'm guessing that St. Thomas Aquinas believed that they came from the ultimate intellect of God.
Yeah, so the second part is right. So if we look in the second sentence here, he says, all the forms that are in these lower substances and all their motions are derived from the intellectual forms which are in the intellect of some substance. So all the forms of the things that we encounter must come, he says, ultimately from the intellect of some substance. He doesn't exactly spell it out right in this sentence where that comes from, but that's important that it's coming from an intellect. Now, for Plato, the forms were their own things. So they weren't, the forms were a principle themselves. Whereas, so Aquinas is saying the forms are, Plato is right that the forms separated from the matter are causes, are principles, but he's wrong in saying that they're all by themselves. They don't exist all by themselves. They exist in the form of, or in an intellect. And he says at the end of that passage that I have there, they exist in an intellect and cause lower forms. So that goes back to God being the origin of the forms of all things. Is that clear?
John, a question? Was he referring to the fact that we are made in God's image and likeness, and that we're endowed with these creative forms, but because of the fall, we really can't realize them?
No, actually, this
Okay.
passage is not getting to that.
Okay, so Aquinas didn't go there.
Well, not in this passage. This passage is not about that. This is just talking about where the formal cause of material things comes from.
I see. Okay.
So if we're looking at question 2 with an avalanche, to what or whom is that avalanche most fundamentally attributed, according to the argument here?
Everything is most fundamentally attributed to the ultimate being, God.
That's right. How?
He is the first cause. Everything else is subsidiary.
Yeah. So how? If we look at paragraph, what's marked paragraph 5 here, every work of nature is the work of an intelligent substance, and an effect is more fundamentally attributed to the prime mover. So in a way, all natural causes, even when they've been immediately caused by something else, can ultimately be attributed to God who set them in motion.
So it's basically the
prime mover.
It's basically the laws of physics which God put in place is what happens with an avalanche. You know, it's sitting out over a cliff too far, and the laws of physics, the gravity is just going to shear it off from the mountain or wherever it is and falls. So you're right. It ultimately goes back to who created the laws of physics. Well, God did, as the ultimate mover.
Right. Yeah. So how about things acting for an end? Can a grain of sand in the desert be said to act for an end? Following the thread.
Well, ultimately, all things exist for the greater glory of God. So yes.
That's right. So how does Aquinas explain that in this passage?
They sort of tend to their own perfection.
That's right. And I think it's interesting here that he uses the word appetite, right? So even natural things in their own way have an appetite towards the good. So even a grain of sand acts for an end, and that end being to, in a way, seek the divine likeness, its own good, its own perfection, as Gina said. What's the difference between something acting for its own good and something seeking the divine likeness? Oh, I just said it's nothing. Okay, so are there any questions on this passage from Summa Contra Gentiles?
Yeah, I have one. The first paragraph at the top of the second column, so it has natural movers in that paragraph. So it's paragraph 4, but it's on the right-hand column. And then the intellectual forms, are they the same thing? The intellectual forms that are in things, are those the same as the natural movers? I was kind of confused about that.
Okay, so when we're talking about forms, there are forms as the object of knowledge, and there are forms in things. Forms as the object of knowledge, or in this case, in this passage, is talking about the formal cause of things that exist. Those forms are in the mind of an intellect, really ultimately in the mind of God. So that's what he's getting at here. Ultimately, that these things come from, that all natural things come from the mind of God. When he's talking about natural movers, what that means, if we're going back to the avalanche example, for instance, at 1 minute, there's a pile of rocks, and then somebody throws a rock at it, and it becomes an avalanche that just tips it over. That last rock is, you could look at as a natural mover. Or me kicking, so an animal kicking a ball, or kicking something is a natural mover. So just things moving according to nature, that's what the natural movers are.
Okay, that made sense to me, but then in the last line it says, from which movers they also receive their forms. That's confusing.
All right.
Maybe-
Yeah, so if we go back to the process of generation, and we're talking about the four causes, in the act of generation, the efficient cause being the parents, say, for a person, okay, and that efficient cause is a natural mover. It's also called, in Aristotle, it's not called the efficient cause, it's called the moving cause, and it's what brings something from potency to act. But if we remember before, that form had to exist in something in actuality first. So the form exists in the parents as the natural mover in generation, and in so in that sense, we get our form from our parents.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, just a little point to make sure I'm kind of clear on this. When he's saying summa contra gentiles, the Gentiles he's referring to are the classic philosophers.
Muslims.
Against the Gentiles.
Well, basically, against any heresy. So summa contra gentiles, you could translate it as against the nations, or against the heretics, against the heathens. So this would be, this is an apologetic work, whereas the Summa Theologiae is more like a catechism, more like an encyclopedia. And we'll take a look in a little bit about the structure of these things and how that.
Wasn't this primarily addressed to Muslim philosophers and Muslim belief?
Perhaps, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head.
I have a question. I'm still confused about the last paragraph here. Of even things that lacking knowledge, right, can be made to work for an end. So I understand that can be made to be work for an end, but I guess I'm confused about the part of how it's kind of describing that they're seeking perfection or tend to their own perfection. And that seems to give them kind of this sense of choice. And I don't understand how we kind of made that connection there.
Right. So things that are set in motion receive their end from the mover. Right. So if you think that, if in the earlier paragraph he uses the analogy of somebody shooting an arrow, right? So if I shoot an arrow, that arrow receives its end from the mover. Now God is the perfect mover. He's the prime mover. He's the one that sets everything in motion. There can't be any error, unlike me when I shoot an arrow, which I did once. Then unlike me, when God sets anything in motion, it's perfect. It perfectly goes towards its end. So that thing, those things that don't have an intellect don't intellectually will themselves toward an end, but they receive their end from their mover. And ultimately that all goes back to God.
Okay, so it's saying that if their mover is kind of moving them towards, right, using them for goodness, right, moving them towards perfection, then that would be being used for good. But it doesn't, that's not necessarily the case.
Well, if it's anything that moves in a natural way, in a way, is good. Now it's a little bit tricky, and I think this will be again a little bit more clear when we get to ethics.
Okay.
I probably should have done the ethics portion up front. All these questions, but what he's really talking about in this passage is not so much questions of like that, but really just looking at the way nature moves, and that nature, by virtue of being created by God and set in motion, acts for the end that its mover set in motion.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, great. So let's take a look, just a few notes here about St. Thomas Aquinas as philosopher. One thing that I've noticed with St. Thomas is his commentaries are amazing, because he breaks down the texts of Aristotle and also texts of Scripture in an extremely precise and organized way, and it's extremely helpful in studying these. I just have a little example here of how he does this. So he says, Aristotle first sets down an introduction. This is the beginning of his commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics. He says this science treats of two things. And he says, first, he points out this. Second, he explains this. In regard to the first, he does two things. First, he shows this. Second, he explains this. So he does this not just with Aristotle, but with Scripture as well. And I think it really brings to light structures in the text that are not immediately apparent to us. So something else, his proof of what he calls the preambles of faith. And these are things that we can come to believe either through faith or through reason, which are prerequisites of faith. For example, that God exists. So his expanding on Aristotle's natural philosophy and metaphysics are really key here. Peter Kreeft, something he notes about Aquinas, that he combines clarity and profundity in a way that's unparalleled. So a lot of philosophers might be really clear, but not particularly profound. And there goes my light again. There we go. And a lot of philosophers might be rather profound, but really not very clear. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, as a philosopher, he is misunderstood by much of subsequent philosophy. And he is sort of lumped in with a lot of, with all of classic philosophy, without really being engaged in a deep way. Okay, now, in reading St. Thomas, before we go into the details here, we're going to look at our last passage on the teacher. So here, let's talk about this. One cannot be called his own teacher, according to Aristotle and St. Thomas. So what does he mean by this?
You can't teach yourself something you don't know, and if you already know it, you're not teaching yourself.
All right, so does that mean we can't learn things on our own?
No, you can discover them, you can learn.
All right, so what's the difference here between discovery and learning from a teacher?
I thought of being a baby and my parents telling me, no, the oven is hot, don't touch it. And then later in life, learning that there are certain plates you can't put in the microwave because when you take them out, they're hot. So my parents didn't teach me, yeah, you can't put that mug in the microwave. But when I took it out and burned the crap out of my hand, I learned. So I discovered it.
That's right. That's right. So now, how about what more precisely can we say about what discovery is?
Is it like using your reason?
Exactly. So discovery is coming to knowledge through the light of reason and experience, as Sarah was just describing. Whereas learning from a teacher is like Sarah said, it's more precisely receiving exactly what's being taught. This, say, one proposition. The burner is hot. Okay, if I hear that and I learn that, then that precise thing I'm taught. Now, in practice, do you think this is a broad or a limited notion of teaching?
It's not usually that either or, right? There's usually some element of each one.
Exactly. Yeah. So if I say I already knew the dates of Saint Anselm, when he was born and died, and let's say somebody taught me the dates of Avicenna. Well, the dates of Avicenna I was taught, but then using the light of reason, I could conclude that, oh, these two philosophers were alive at the same time, right? So in practice, we have this constant interplay, right, with learning and discovery. But what he's talking about very precisely here is that we don't know something before we're taught it in the same way that we're taught it, right? Before I learned the dates of Avicenna's birth and death, I didn't know it. So then I would say I was taught the dates of Avicenna's birth and death, but I learned that he and Saint Anselm were contemporaries by discovery.
It seems like a pretty narrow definition of a teacher. Because, well, as limiting the teacher is just kind of being this repository of knowledge, right? And that the student, on the other hand, is just kind of this bucket that the teacher pours knowledge into. But I mean, I'm a teacher, so I always thought that the teacher did more than that. In particular, a teacher would show the student how to use their rationality in order to discover things on their own. So
yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Sarah.
I mean, I'm a teacher as well, and we use models of guided inquiry and guided discovery and PBL, but you still have to teach the techniques and the structure of that way of learning so that the kids can really truly have meaningful discovery. Think of a science project where you give them you give them a procedure to follow and questions to explore, as opposed to a Bunsen burner and some mystery tubes and free range. So I don't think that it sells the teacher short, because I was on the lookout for that too.
I think I think that if we're looking at, I think that the way I described it a few minutes ago, where the teacher teaches this particular fact or this particular proposition, is one thing. But like we were just saying, both of you, Kirk and Sarah, that teaching a method, teaching a way of using your gift, that's another thing to be taught. So you can teach your students as a teacher how to do something. You can teach them a method, and then what they do with that is discovery. So then that goes beyond what you've taught them. So you're right. He's using a very technical notion of teaching and learning here.
Yeah, I was just wondering if he generally sees the teacher as a person, or I was thinking just about how many friends homeschool and some of the kids are learning, and I learned too a lot from reading. Is that would he see like the book as the teacher, or no, I'm taking an idea presented by a teacher and discovering it in greater detail and fact through a book? I was just curious, kind of taking his writing and apply, like in our times right now, what he would think of,
Yeah,
like
so
what he meant and how.
just like with a teacher speaking to you, a
Mhm.
book can take that form of a teacher too. So whether you learn it, whether you learn something, a fact or a technique from a book or from a live teacher, that would still fall within this more strict notion of teaching. And then it's that taking it further, using your own reason, that's discovery. So who's the primary teacher? This is not one of my questions, but who's the primary teacher?
God,
That's right. Why?
because he's he's behind it all. There are no other teachers without him. He's the one that creates, and he's the one that sets the rules, and he's the one that allows other people to have reason to be able to teach. Everything else is secondary.
So that last point is really important here, because all of us, Aquinas associates our discovery as with our agent intellect, with our faculty for reason, which is something placed in us directly by God. So, and any of the other things that we are taught are taught by somebody who has learned from things that are created by God, using gifts that were given by God. So ultimately, the cause of all teaching of any kind is God.
Hey, John, can you point to where that would be in the reading, where we could work on that a little more?
He doesn't discuss that in this passage.
Okay.
But if you go to, so these are excerpts from De Veritate, question 11. And when we take a look at the works of St. Thomas, you'll see where that is online, and you can go read more about that, because he has quite a bit to say here.
He does say, though, right, that the teacher is the cause of knowledge, right, and is kind of talking about this superiority. So by that argument, too, you could say God is the only being with complete knowledge, therefore he could be the only true teacher.
Right, exactly. And that can actually relate back also to what we were talking about before, about the ultimate intellect being the source of all forms of things as well. Okay, let's, do we have any other questions on this? All right, let's go back here. So let's take a look at the structure of the Summa. And I'm going to bring my little markers up here. Okay, the Summa is divided into 4 parts, or it's kind of divided into 3 parts. I'll show you why this is sort of a confusing question. We have the first part, which you'll see represented by a 1, Roman numeral 1 here. We have the first part of the second part, which is represented in abbreviation by Roman numeral 1-2. And then the second part of the second part, 2-2, okay? And then the third part, 3. Now in each part, there are several treatises. Now sometimes you'll see a treatise, a title for the first several questions in the first part relating to God. But in the ones I was looking at, there some had it and some didn't. But at any rate, you have a treatise, which is a selection of questions. Then you have a question, which is really it's not just one question, it's generally multiple questions. Okay, we have a question. Then within a question, there are multiple articles. Okay, I've taken a sample article from the Summa here. So the question on the nature and extent of sacred doctrine, which is theology. So each article begins with whether, which is in Latin utrum, and then something, in this case, whether it is a science. Then there will be a series of objections. If you remember when we looked at oh, I guess I don't have it up there, but if you look at your sheet on the teacher, there's an objection there. That's actually, or it says difficulties. It says difficulties, but those are objections. And those are arguments that are contrary to what St. Thomas is going to argue. Okay, so an objection, it always begins with oportet, it seems that, and then something. Okay, then St. Thomas will respond with, on the contrary, sed contra, and then there will be a shorter rebuttal argument that is usually from authority of sacred scripture, philosophy, or the church fathers. And then the fuller response in I respond, which this section is the respondeo. And then he gives the main argument of this article. And then he goes back to these objections and he replies to them. Okay, so that's the structure. We have a part, and then we have a treatise, but here's the meat of it. There's a question, which will have multiple articles. Okay, an article has this structure. It has a question. I know it's confusing to have the question in the article and not in the question, but that's how it is. It's in the article, and then there's a series of objections, sed contra, respondeo, and then the reply. Now, this is modeled after the medieval method of disputation in the schools. This is what they would do. Not only did they do this in writing, but they did this live. So teachers and students in the classroom, the student would pose some objections in the form of an argument to the teacher, and the teacher would reply in this, something like this form.
John, is this just like the rhetoric that St. Augustine was known for? Is this called rhetoric also?
No. So this form is unique to the medieval schools, and it developed well after Augustine. So the methods of rhetoric that he learned were something in they were a form of argument that sort of, you could think of it as going beyond. We discussed logic before. Logic precedes rhetoric. So first you learn grammar. This is the trivium, the first 3 things you would learn in school. First you would learn grammar, which is kind of how to talk in a sensible way. You would learn logic in order to put arguments together in a structured way. Then you would learn rhetoric, which would be ways to formulate your argument in a larger way to make it more elegant and more convincing in a variety of ways. Okay, then abbreviating these, you might see this, Summa Theologiae. You'll see the part, okay, this is the first part. You'll see the question, and then you'll see the article. Or it might be shortened just to this, but you'll always have the part, the question, the article. Then, if your reference, whatever you're looking at, might have a reference to an objection, or to the sed contra, or to the respondio, or to the reply to the objection, okay? Because that always starts ad primum, okay, to the first objection. That's what it means. Okay, so I think a good way to approach this, I have this list here. First, start with the respondio. When you're looking at an article, start with the respondio. This is the meat of the argument. And so that's what you want to get to the main point. Get to the main point, read the respondio, then go back and read the objection 1, which is the argument against it. Then the reply to that objection, and then do that with all of the objections. And then go back again and read the sed contra and respondio. In each of these sections, what you're looking for within the argument, what's the conclusion? What are the reasons that lead to that? So again, looking at this, actually, I'm going to pull up this very question. Okay, we're not going to go through this in detail, but just structurally, okay? So what I suggest for starting out, going into St. Thomas, is, all right, you read the question, whether sacred doctrine is a science. Then go right down to here. If you want to get to the point, this is the point. I answer that. Sacred doctrine is a science. And then he gets into his reasons for that. What you want to look for is indicators for a conclusion. Okay, again, he's repeating here, it is that sacred doctrine is a science because this is going to give you probably your main point, okay, the main meat of the argument, which is going to be explained in more detail leading up to that. Okay, so you'll get to that, then go back and if you want to go deeper into it, look at the objections. Objection 1, here's an argument against that idea. Here's his reply to objection 1. His reply to objection 1 is usually, to the objections, is usually going to be drawn from this argument in the main section. Okay, then objection 2, reply to objection 2. And then come back here and read this part of the meat again. Then after you get used to that for a while, you can just read them straight through. But this is generally the recommended way to start reading the Summa, is to start by going right to the main point and then go to the objections. There's been more than one philosophy student or theology student who have gotten confused because they've thought St. Thomas is contradicting himself when they see one thing up here in the objections and another thing down here. These are not St. Thomas's objections. These are things that would be objections from his students or from his contemporaries or from his predecessors. Often arguments from Plato, from Avicenna, Averroes, or from just from his fellow teachers. Okay, so some resources for getting the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, and this is in the PDF of the print-friendly slides that I posted earlier. So let's take a look here. This is all of St. Thomas Aquinas' works in English. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. Okay, here are his main ones: Summa contra Gentiles, Summa Theologiae. So if I click here for Summa contra Gentiles, you get the main sections here. Let's pick one, creation. Okay, and you can find the article of interest. All right, and you can see this is just laid out straight through. This is just an argument top to bottom. This is not in the disputation form. Looking at the Summa Theologiae, Okay, so treatise on creation. Let's take a look at that. So treatise on creation, and then there are questions we can look at of the beginning of the duration of creatures. And then there are 3 articles within that question. Whether creatures always existed, whether they that began to exist is an article of faith, how God is said to have created heaven and earth in the beginning. So if you want to know his answer to the question, whether creatures always existed, which is one we mentioned before as being condemned in those 1277 condemnations, you jump down here. If you want to get to the main point, skip past all those objections, well, there are quite a few, and get to his response. Okay, his response. Then if you want, go back and see, well, what are the arguments that are against this that people were putting forward? And you can read those arguments. Okay, another resource I have mentioned there is the Summa on the New Advent website. The reason I like this is because it's searchable. You can say if you want to know about knowledge of angels. Okay, Summa, the knowledge of the angels. You can pick your question, and then go right to it. Okay, so that one is searchable. The Thomistic Institute has a free Aquinas 101 video course. Okay, so you can go to this link and sign up for that, and it will also give you an introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas's philosophy and theology, and reading his works. It'll probably give you a little bit more thorough introduction to the basic concepts that and terms that you're going to come up in reading St. Thomas. Then we might be able to address here. Okay, then also a link, if you're interested, to a couple links to the works of Aristotle online. Now, something else I want to show you here. Okay, I mentioned Summa Contra Gentiles, Summa Theologiae. We are looking at a passage. The passage on the teacher is from De Veritate. That's here. Okay, this is also in the disputation form on the teacher. Okay, so it's labeled as difficulties, but these are objections. All right. So here's the question in Article 1: Can a man or only God teach and be called teacher? All right, and he goes through that. Many objections, and then sed contra. This is the sed contra section, and then the fuller reply. Okay, so it's labeled a little bit differently than the Summa, but it's the same structure. Then I also want to point out his biblical commentaries here. Okay, so his commentaries on the Bible. I'm just going to pick a random section here. He has the passage, and then, just like I was saying before with Aristotle, he breaks down the structure very precisely. And if you really want to study a passage, this is a great way to do it. Because right at the beginning, before he gets into the commentary proper, then he has this breakdown of the structure of that passage, how one part relates to another. Okay, so just a little review of the things we looked at today. 2 parts in the history of medieval philosophy and about St. Thomas Aquinas. Looked a little bit about some of the philosophers that were the transition from antiquity into the Middle Ages. A little bit, we looked at 2 Muslim and 1 Jewish philosopher. Talked about how the discovery or renewed interest in the works of Aristotle was important to medieval philosophy in bringing on the scholastic movement. And St. Thomas Aquinas, about his life, his works, significance as a philosopher, and ways to read him. So do we have any questions or discussion now?
I just wanted to offer another resource. I purchased it for one of my students who who took the name Aquinas at his confirmation. It's a book called 1 Minute Aquinas, and they're just short essays based, short summaries from the Summa that answers some of the questions that you might come across. But there are also, it's great because there are citations to the Summa as well. So if anybody's looking for a gift, or if or even I downloaded it, and it's been a real, it's not super deep or anything like that, but it's a great way to get your feet wet and to find basic answers to some of the things that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you. So that's another, and now that you mentioned that, I'm typing into the chat. I typed in that one, and I'm typing in a couple other resources that are a great intro to St. Thomas and his philosophy. The book is Peter Kreif's Summa of the Summa. All right, that's a great one, and he has a great introduction, and he goes in a little bit more depth about, in his introduction, about reading Aquinas. The nice thing about this, which is the primary philosophical passages of Aquinas, is that he cuts out all of the objections that aren't going to be as interesting or as relevant. So he really gets to the meat of these articles, and his extensive footnotes are really helpful in understanding the terminology and Aquinas's interaction with and reaction to other philosophers. And then his book, Kreif's book, A Shorter Summa, is kind of the similar thing, but it's just smaller, smaller selection. All right, well, next week we'll be taking a look at two broad topics, ethics and natural law. So we'll get into some basic principles of ethics, and then how that relates to law and natural law. So thanks for a great class, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you.